There is a newer line of response to the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, spearheaded by Matthew McCormick, which is based upon a comparison between the evidence for Jesus' resurrection and the evidence for the Salem witch trials. A certain segment of online counter-apologists, notably my friend Ben Watkins from Real Atheology, have been impressed with McCormick's argument. John Loftus has also indicated to me that he would endorse McCormick's basic approach to the case for the resurrection. As such, it merits some attention here. Like most of the skeptics I have engaged, McCormick rejects the second premise of my argument, asserting the credibility of the New Testament witness to the resurrection of Jesus. As he explains, up until a few hundred years ago, the traditional view was that all of the Gospels were written by the followers of Jesus for whom the books are named. But the view now, on the basis of modern work in history and Bible scholarship, is that none of the Gospels were written by the apostle to whom it is attributed. Their authors are unknown. Furthermore, it is widely agreed that none of the authors were eyewitnesses to the events themselves. They heard the stories from others and recorded them many years after the alleged events transpired. All McCormick offers by way of a defense for rejecting the traditional ascriptions of authorship is to appeal to the fact that this is widely agreed upon by contemporary biblical scholars. While this is true, it is worth asking if contemporary biblical scholars have good reasons for this agreement, and in my videos on gospel authorship and gospel anonymity, I already assessed their reasons and found them to be wanting. Furthermore, I found that they have underappreciated the positive case for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. As such, McCormick doesn't offer anything new to the conversation on this front. Indeed, he doesn't even seem to be familiar with it. He appears to have just uncritically accepted the opinions of mainstream biblical scholarship on this matter. But even if traditional authorship is granted, McCormick thinks that there is a further reason not to trust the gospel authors, namely that they were uneducated and biased. As he says, we have good reasons to doubt that the record is impartial and objective, and the people who recorded and transmitted the Jesus miracles did not have the conceptual tools, investigative methods, principles of good evidence, or background knowledge that would be necessary to adequately evaluate and represent the phenomena. There are two key points to raise in reply to McCormick here. The first is that being impartial or unbiased is not a necessary prerequisite for being honest or for being trustworthy. Clearly, McCormick himself is quite biased towards the testimony of modern, educated, scientifically literate people, but this doesn't mean that we have to therefore reject everything that McCormick says. Angus Menuge notes the irony, saying, McCormick argues that the biblical reports of the resurrection are not credible because they reflected believers' enthusiasm, desire, and ideological commitments, and because their low levels of scientific knowledge, education, and literacy would have given them a low level of skepticism for what we would identify as supernatural, miraculous, or paranormal claims. However, both of the charges commit a genetic fallacy and hint of red herrings too, and reveal a serious modernist bias in McCormick's own approach. Second, and more importantly, the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection don't need any special academic qualifications or conceptual distinctions in order for us to be able to trust their testimony, as McCormick seems to think. They simply need the common ability to tell the difference between a person's being alive and being dead. Again, Menuge makes this point well. The important point is that establishing that a resurrection occurs does not require any unfamiliar special test. We do not have to confirm some bizarre theory of how a resurrection happens, but simply apply the normal tests for telling if someone is alive or dead. The only difference in the case of the resurrection is that the tests are applied in reverse of the normal order, death preceding life instead of life preceding death. McCormick does offer some other fairly standard objections to the trustworthiness of the Gospels, and later in his book, he defends the plausibility of bereavement hallucinations to account for the resurrection appearances. I have addressed most of these points in other videos or elsewhere in this one, so I want to bypass all of that for the sake of focusing upon McCormick's truly unique contribution to this debate, namely his claim that the quality of the evidence for the resurrection is comparable to the quality of the evidence for witchcraft at Salem. Hence, if one rejects the idea that witchcraft transpired at Salem, then they should also reject the reality of the resurrection. McCormick presents this argument in Chapter 3 of his book, Atheism and the Case Against Christ. As he puts it, does our evidence justify concluding that there was real magic at Salem? Much can be said for the supernatural explanation. First, hundreds of people were involved in concluding that some of the accused were witches. Eyewitnesses testified in court, signed sworn affidavits, and demonstrated their utter conviction that those on trial were witches. Furthermore, the accusers came from diverse backgrounds and social strata, including magistrates, judges, the governor of Massachusetts, respected members of the community, husbands of the accused, and so on. They all became passionately convinced that the charges were true on the basis of what they had seen. The witnesses, accusers, and investigators had a great deal to lose by being correct. Men would lose their wives, children would lose their mothers, community members would lose friends they cared about. It seems very unlikely that such accusers could have ulterior motives leading them to such a dramatic and profound conclusion. Accusing a friend or a wife of being a witch very likely would have the horrible outcome of getting her executed. And he goes on to drive his point home saying, "Of course, I am not making a serious case for real witchcraft at Salem. I do not think you should conclude that the accused were really witches. The point is that they were not witches, and you probably do not believe that they were, based on this substantial body of historical evidence. If we take seriously the attempts to prove the resurrection of Jesus on historical grounds, then, in order to be consistent, we must also accept that the Salem witches actually performed acts of black magic." So right off the bat, there are some real problems here. In the first place, there is a critical difference between the context in which the witchcraft and the resurrection are supposed to have occurred. The Salem witch trials occurred within a staunchly Puritan colony where fear of witchcraft was already acknowledged as an abiding threat. As such, it is not surprising that this might have been a readily acknowledged possibility for all sorts of phenomena. As Emerson Baker observes in his scholarly study of the Salem witch trials, Salem offered a perfect storm, a unique convergence of conditions and events that produced what was, by far, the largest and most lethal witchcraft episode in American history. Salem was a small part of a much larger pattern. Although England and her colonies saw fewer cases of witchcraft accusations than on the continent, they were still common and long-standing. Between 1645 and 1647, at the height of the English Civil Wars, more than 250 people were accused of witchcraft in East Anglia, and more than 100 were executed, 15 in one day. In Salem, a total of 25 people lost their lives. Indeed, so paranoid were the residents of Salem about witches that they thought that even unusual behavior from animals counted as evidence for witchcraft. Again, Baker says, "Witches were also believed to be able to assume the shape of animals. Thus, unusual behavior in an animal, especially a strange one, might suggest the presence of a witch, and goes on to suggest the step from affliction to accusation was a short one. Today we attribute mass psychogenic illness to global concerns about toxic waste and terrorism, but in 1692, the omnipresent threat was witchcraft. In 1692, everyone believed in the existence of witches in league with the devil, who had been created by God as a challenge to man. During the Salem witch trials, there was no dispute over the existence of witches. All ministers and learned people knew that witches were real and that they had the power to harm. The debate was over how one detected witchcraft and whether the victims were truly victims or were just faking their ailments. The point, again, is just that the Salem witch trials occurred within a context where people were already primed to appeal to witchcraft as an explanation for certain events. By contrast, the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection occurred in the context of Second Temple Judaism, where there was no expectation at all that a resurrection would occur in the middle of history. In other words, the people involved in the Salem witch trials were already primed to appeal to witchcraft to explain things in a way which first century Jews were not primed to appeal to a resurrection. There is an element of social contagion present in the case of the Salem witch trials, which is simply not present for the resurrection. Second, McCormick's claim about what the witnesses stood to lose in the case of the Salem witch trials is not analogous to what the witnesses to the resurrection stood to lose. McCormick points out that the witnesses at Salem stood to lose certain women within their community. But why exactly are we to suppose that the witnesses would have been strongly motivated to protect these women within their community? Surely we are all too familiar with jealousy and dislike for people among the members of communities. So it's not terribly difficult to imagine that certain individuals within the Massachusetts Bay Colony would have been willing to give false testimony against other members of the community. Losing certain members of the community may have been viewed as a benefit rather than a loss. As Baker puts it, those accused of witchcraft were perceived as a threat, directly or indirectly, or as somehow related to a threat to the spiritual, political, or military stability and well-being of the community or the colony. Furthermore, there can be no doubt that the accusations involved power and authority, and, in particular, their perceived misuse and corruption. If any one factor links virtually all of the accused, it has to be religion. The trials were largely an effort to bolster Puritanism, an orthodoxy under attack on multiple fronts, for in Massachusetts Bay, religion was the fabric that held the polity and society together. Many of those accused were perceived as posing a threat to the religious order. And indeed, when one looks at the situation preceding the Salem witch trials, it looks rather plausible that these people would be willing to lie about one another. Emerson Baker observes how two of the principal witnesses, Joseph and Bathsheba Pope, were part of the minority of Quakers within the Bay Colony. Coincidentally, they were also Benjamin Franklin's uncle and aunt. These two had previously been persecuted by several members of the dominant Puritan community. It is therefore not unfathomable that they should have been willing to falsely accuse their neighbors of witchcraft due to a lingering grudge. As Baker concludes, the story of the popes also reveals the complexities behind witch trials in Salem and elsewhere in New England, as well as some of the inaccuracies in how these events are often portrayed. Traditional textbooks and popular tales make the trials sound like a Puritan affair, yet the popes were Quakers. Indeed, Baker goes on for the entirety of chapter 3 of his book, detailing the turbulent history of Salem arguing that the village was ripe for something like this to break out. As he concludes, regardless of which factor ultimately was most important, the witchcraft accusations resulted from a long-standing failure of leadership. Not only did Salem Village's ministers fail to help resolve the divisions, but something about the ministry there brought out the worst in them. Overall, this was not a group to inspire confidence, let alone build a community of Christian believers in the face of adversity. Given its small size, poor pay, and frontier location, Salem Village was not able to attract the gifted divines who could have healed its wounds. The battle lines were drawn for a new kind of war, against sinners and worse. So McCormick simply doesn't know what he's talking about when he claims that the people of Salem would have been strongly motivated to avoid lying about one another. The evidence suggests just the opposite, namely that there were sufficiently vicious inner conflicts and divisions to lead to these sorts of false accusations. By contrast, when it comes to the apostles, they stood to lose their own livelihoods and even their own lives for proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. We know that human beings are, as a general rule, strongly motivated to protect their own well-being, so the motivations to not deliberately lie are not even remotely similar for the respective witnesses in these cases. Third, McCormick overlooks contemporary counter-evidence. Notably, the governor of Massachusetts forbade any publication pertaining to the trials in recognition that things had gone horribly wrong. As Baker points out, one reason that witchcraft disappeared from the public record was that the governor of Massachusetts Bay insisted upon it. Engaging in one of the first cover-ups in American history, Governor Sir William Phips banned the publication of any account of the witch trials. Even before the trials ended, people realized that something had gone horribly wrong, and that some innocent people had died. This is a tacit acknowledgement that it was well known from very early on that the quality of the evidence was not anything like sufficient to condemn many of those who died at Salem on charges of witchcraft. McCormick simply doesn't mention any of this. But the situation for the resurrection is very different. No one close to the events leaves a trail of trying to cover something up. On the contrary, the early Christians readily invited people to check out the truth of their testimony for themselves. This is another significant difference between the evidence for witchcraft at Salem and the evidence for the resurrection. On a related note, some of the witnesses are just known to have been fakes. Baker points out that one of the principal early witnesses was Mary Warren, who was supposedly being afflicted by someone accused of being a witch, and yet had a remarkable recovery as soon as her master threatened to whip her. Margaret Jacobs famously recanted of her testimony, saying that it was all a lie. Baker rightly says, while it is possible that the erratic behavior of the girls sparked a mass psychological phenomenon, a considerable amount of deliberate fraud eventually took place, carried out for a range of reasons. Scholars have speculated that Abigail Williams might have accused people because of the attention she received. By contrast, none of the apostles are known to have recanted of their belief in the resurrection, despite facing persecution and death. Fourth, quantity of testimony is not the same thing as quality of testimony. McCormick makes much of the sheer amount of testimony we have for the presence of witchcraft at Salem, saying, "How much evidence do we have? Enough to fill a truck." Modern archives at the University of Virginia and elsewhere have thousands of documents, books, records, transcripts, affidavits, testimonials, and other works detailing the events. But there is this thing called the law of diminishing returns. At a certain point, simply piling on more witnesses gets one only a marginal degree of greater confirmation. Eventually, the quality of the testimony itself has to be assessed if significantly more evidential mileage is to be had out of it. And here is precisely where the defender of the resurrection claims to have the advantage, for the details of the testimony pertaining to witchcraft at Salem often do not justify the belief that witchcraft was present. Emerson Baker observes that in some cases, the testimony consisted of nothing more than vague references to being tormented by specters of the accused. As he says, like some of her neighbors, Bathsheba said that she was afflicted by witches, specifically claiming that the specters of John Proctor, Martha Corey, and Rebecca Nurse tormented her. But what exactly is it like to be tormented by a specter? And how would this indicate that someone is guilty of witchcraft? We have no idea. No details are present in this sort of testimony, which provides a significant symmetry breaker with the testimony about the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Furthermore, this affliction was not experienced by more than one person at a time. As Baker notes, Bathsheba and her cohorts suffered spectral attack. That is, they were assaulted by a spirit that was invisible to everyone except the afflicted. As the circle of accusation grew in Salem village, the afflicted would even point the finger at people they had never seen in person. These are but a few of the contradictions behind what happened in 1692 during a witch hunt that, in many ways, was an aberration from earlier proceedings. So we can see that the element of corroborating testimony is also missing from most of these accusations. To be sure, many people might have claimed to suffer spectral attack from the same person, but the actual instances of it were thought to be private events which were incapable of being shared even in principle. This too provides a significant difference between the supposed witchcraft at Salem and the resurrection appearances of Jesus, for Jesus is experienced in the Gospels by groups of people, and the Gospels serve to corroborate one another. In some cases, the testimony consisted of nothing more than descriptions of illness which people at the time simply didn't understand and interpreted as affliction by invisible demons, followed by delirious claims from those who were ill. Again, Baker explains, Reverend Samuel Parris and his wife Elizabeth began to notice that their daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams were behaving oddly. Betty was 9, and her cousin was about 11, vulnerable ages in a time when illness all too often proved deadly. Soon the minister called in friends and colleagues, including Reverend John Hale from neighboring Beverly, to observe the girls. Hale noted, these children were bitten and pinched by invisible agents. Their arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that way, and returned back again, so it was impossible for them to do of themselves, and beyond the power of any epileptic fits or natural disease to affect. Sometimes they were taken dumb, their mouths stopped, their throats choked, their limbs racked and tormented. They also suffered by pins invisibly stuck into their flesh, and pricking with irons. They baked a loaf of rye bread, mixed with some urine from the afflicted girls, then fed it to the family dog. This was one of many known counter-magical folk remedies. When the dog ate the witch cake, it was supposed to reveal the witch's identity. Indeed, the afflicted girls soon cried out that it was Tituba who was tormenting them. I ask if this sounds anything like the accounts of the resurrected Jesus in the Gospels. Are the sightings of Jesus in the Gospels something which can be easily explained away by physical ailments and delirium, coupled with a healthy dose of superstition? In my judgment, the answer is clearly negative. But McCormick just glosses over these sorts of critical differences, claiming that the evidence for witchcraft is just as good as the evidence for the resurrection. In other cases, the evidence for witchcraft consisted of nothing more than a bunch of people testifying to strange or unusual happenings, but nothing which could reasonably be interpreted as witchcraft. As Baker comments, as was often the case at witch trials, the accusations confirmed the long-held suspicions of neighbors, who then came forward to recount a long history of Bishop's satanic acts. A total of 10 witnesses testified about strange actions that surrounded her, some dating back to the 1670s. From unusual accidents and the disappearance of money to mysterious deaths and her apparent ability to summon monstrous satanic imps, Bishop's was a bilious reservoir of the invisible world. To no one's surprise, Bishop was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Apparently, McCormick thinks that testimony pertaining to a history of unusual events supports the reality of witchcraft as strongly as the testimony of multiple people having bodily experiences of the risen Jesus supports the resurrection. But I take it that the asymmetry is obvious. Astonishingly, despite all of this, McCormick still claims, with apparent sincerity, that the evidence for witchcraft at Salem is actually of better quality than the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, saying, when it is put up against the case for the resurrection, in the important respects, the historical evidence for witchcraft is better than the historical argument for the resurrection. We do not have any of the original Gospels, only copies from centuries later. The Gospel stories are only a few anecdotal hearsay stories from passionate and committed religious adherents passed by word of mouth for decades through an unknown number of people before being written down. All that remains of those stories are copies of copies from decades or even centuries later, then were actively called and patched together from a wider range of more varied writings. By reasonable measures of quantity and quality, the evidence we have for witchcraft at Salem is vastly better than the evidence we have for the magical return from the dead by Jesus. But this claim can only hold water if McCormick is right in his assessment of the Gospels as late unreliable hearsay in the first place. But the defender of my resurrection argument, and indeed probably of most resurrection arguments, is not likely to agree with McCormick's assessment of the Gospels. And as already noted, McCormick makes no attempt whatsoever to defend this assessment of the Gospels. Surely, if McCormick were to be right about the Gospels being of as little historical value as he thinks, then he would be correct that the evidence for the resurrection would be comparable to the evidence for witchcraft at Salem, which is to say not very strong. But that is precisely the point of contention between McCormick and myself. I do not agree with him regarding what the Gospels are, and the comparison to the Salem witch trials only succeeds on that unargued assumption. Consequently, the whole comparison to the Salem witch trials is irrelevant. If I agreed with McCormick about the Gospels, I would automatically agree with him that belief in the resurrection is unjustified, and I would agree with this even apart from his comparison to the Salem witch trials. The real premise of McCormick's argument, which I take issue with, then, is that the Gospels are the end result of years of stories being passed down to unknown authors. Without that premise, the comparison to the Salem witch trials cannot be made, and it is precisely this premise which McCormick utterly fails to defend. All in all, McCormick's book simply fails to engage the substantial amount of argumentation which Christian scholars have put forward in defense of the historical credibility of the Gospels, opting instead to lazily take the opinions of critical scholarship at face value. Even more problematic is how McCormick fails to critically engage recent scholarship surrounding the Salem witch trials, For how confidently he asserts that the evidence for the resurrection is comparable to the evidence for witchcraft at Salem, McCormick's book demonstrates surprisingly little knowledge of the specific evidence. Indeed, based upon Baker's persuasively argued research, I think that the conclusion that McCormick is simply repeating a sort of pop history about the Salem witch trials, which lacks a substantial basis in history, is more than warranted. This has caused him to grossly overestimate the quality of evidence for witchcraft at Salem. His failure to seriously engage conservative biblical scholarship has correspondingly caused him to grossly underestimate the quality of the evidence for the resurrection, thereby skewing his final judgment about the respective quality of the evidence for both events.